Tanche, my name is Larry Quinney, Larry Francis Quinney, recorded as number 294 by the bureaucracy of Indian Affairs, citizen of the Indian Nation of Turtle Island, north of the 49th parallel, a member of the Unipohos, Paskiagewin, reserved lands by Woods peoples of the North American Indians, reserved lands numbered as 121 and 121A and 122. In the Indian way, our way, I'm known as he who steps on frogs. I thought maybe that it wouldn't be maybe, but some of the things that have been bothering me, I'd just like to remind our peoples, to remind them that the Creator, our Father, gave us constitutional law. He created us with laws, a constitution that we have honored for many, many generations. When the Crown proposed the spirit and intent of a treaty, that spirit and intent was deliberated across this country by our peoples, the Indian nation, the tribes that formed the Indian nation. And for 200 years it was deliberated. When they were trying to buy this land, a warrior stood up. A great-grandfather used to say that he picked up a handful of dirt, a piece of Mother Earth, and he told the white man that we're trying to buy this land, Turtle Island. From where you came, you can pile up the monies all the way to here. You would never be able to afford this handful of dirt. For that warrior said, this is life. This dirt is life. The money is just material. So this is one of the things, the laws of the Indian nation. And those constitutional laws still exist. They're still here with the Indian nation. The Indian nation continues to honor these laws, their constitution given them by creation. How to raise the children, the man, the elders, the woman, all their duties, all their commitments in regards to our peoples as a nation. They still exist. And that what was used at the time of the treaty, that constitutional law was used by our great leaders who concluded the treaty with the treaty law. From our constitution, the treaty law was created. And that treaty law was a commitment made, consented to by both nations. It was consented by our forefathers and by the Crown. And that consent given cannot change. It cannot change. For the Crown said, so long as there's an Indian from generation to generation, it will not change. My words shall go on forever. So long as the moon will shine, so long as the sun will shine, so long as there's water in the lakes and run in the rivers and creeks, my words shall last forever. And that was the spirit and intent of the Crown when he promised us 5% of the mines and minerals, 3% of the taxes collected, 3% of the lumber industry, plus stumpage beside. He promised all the Indian Act under their Indian Act. The original spirit and intent of the Indian Act that is enforceable upon them. What they promised as how they were going to administer the Indian Act under a bureaucracy of Indian affairs. And that Indian Act is enforceable upon them because this is what they promised, they consented to do in regards to being the trustee of the Indian nation, all of the Indian nation's resources, the fish, the waters, the animals. This is the trust as a trustee to uphold that consent and that commitment. So everybody is committed by that consent. Whoever lives north of the 49th parallel. That treaty was made between the Crown and the Indian nation. And that the original spirit and intent of the Indian Act is enforceable upon the bureaucracy of Indian affairs to honor the Crown's duties, the commitments that were made to manage, to administer all of the resources across this country that belongs to the Indian. The country still belongs to the Indian. All the animals, the fish, a warden was promised by the Crown. A warden to help to keep our animals. Whoever wants to hunt and fish within our country, they have to pay for it with a license. And that money is generated from the licenses. That revenue is supposed to go into our account, the Indian nation's account, including the 5% of the mines and minerals, the 3% of the taxes collected, the 3% of the lumber industry. They can't say that this land belongs to them and they can do whatever they want. They committed by consent. It's an international treaty and it's enforceable by law. When they gave us the red coat to be our servants, to be obedient like our sons, to have these laws enforceable. You see, today they're fighting over the lobster fisheries. What is wrong with the consent given by the Crown? It was already done, it was already finished. All these fish, offshore, inshore, all across this country, they belong to the Indian people, except they're to be administered in such a way where those licenses obtained by those people other than an Indian, those licenses are supposed to be going into our treasury. We don't have to be fighting over the fish, over the pipelines, over the resources. They still belong to the Indian. We have a share and an interest in all the resources of this country, except they're supposed to be administered and managed properly. And those shares are administered. You talk about the NRTA, the Natural Resource Transfer. It's only an administration by the provinces. It was never given off the top of the administration of those resources, 5% of the mines and minerals, 3% of the taxes collected, 3% of the lumber industry. The water was never a part of the treaty. But however, waters continued to be sold. What's going to happen if we're going to fight over water? It was all settled. It was all done. It was all completed. Everything. It was all encompassing, all inclusive. It's constant, it's repetitive, and it's exact. There, we don't have to create new roads like the Truth and Reconciliation. The truth has never been told. I'm trying to tell you the truth. How can there be reconciliation without the truth? You can't have an international declaration that's trying to be signed by Trudeau when already it was consented by the Crown. Everything was consented. When I say it's all encompassing, all inclusive, it was already given consent that the Crown will honor and be compliant to the constitutional law of the Indian people on Turtle Island. It was already consented and committed. You don't need an international declaration. The king tree that rises in the center of the pole, in the center of the lodges, that king tree, it rises for all of God's children, all over the world, all of humanity. It doesn't only rise for the Indian people. It rises for all things below the water, above the water, below the ground, above the ground, all that flies in the sky. So that in this ceremony, the spirituality of our Father's constitutional law, everything is prayed. It is prayed in ceremony. The songs are sung, asking God's creation to speak on our behalf as children, so that there may be balance and harmony, so that humanity shall continue to live. It's not about a charter of rights and freedoms. It's not about individual rights. It's about the whole. It's about balance. It's about harmony. The things that are being created falsely by a foreign government, by the Crown's federal and provincial governments. They create an Indian Act, which is not the Indian Act. They're trying to enforce that policy upon us. That Indian Act is not the Indian Act. The original spirit and intent of the Indian Act, when they committed and consented, it's enforceable upon them. The Indians' constitutional law is enforceable on the Indian Act. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or whatever you want to call them into the future, they are responsible to make sure there's peace and good order. And that the laws of the Indians' constitution is enforceable upon them. And that's what they committed. They committed to integrate and assimilate, to understand our language, to understand our constitution, And that's the assimilation and the integration, not flipped around where our people were brainwashed in residential schools and day schools and all these things that happened to our people. And today our people believe that we made a treaty with the federal government and we have to run to the federal government and try to defend ourselves with their law, with their policy, with the federal law, with provincial law, provincial policy. It's not really law, it's really just policy. But I don't know why the legal councils that are created and have learned the white man's ways, they try to argue and defend the Indian nation through a foreign government's law, by using federal legislation, by using provincial legislation. I thought that when you become a legal counsel of a client, you have to be able to defend that client. So the only reason why these legal councils are able to defend chiefs and councils, because they are defending a corporate structure of the federal government. And those corporate appointments by the federal government, they are boards of the federal government, corporate boards. And those corporate boards are taxing our people. They're taking the trust monies of their citizens. I can't see that they're citizens, but they're fellow citizens. They're fellow members of the bands. They're taking those monies for travel. They're taking those monies for phone calls and administration. And they're using those monies without the permission of those peoples that are beneficiaries to that trust monies. It's a form of theft. Stealing from your own people to enter into corporate structures. Why do you have to buy a pipeline? Why do you have to buy into when you already hold an interest of all the mines and minerals right across this country? What is being produced by the corporate structure of the Crown? We allowed the Crown and her subjects to mine this island, and that this island still belongs to the Indian nation as a whole. It's held in trust by the Crown. The benefits that's supposed to stem from all of our resources, and the trustee, the Crown's Governor General, the Crown's Lieutenant Governor Generals of every province that are supposed to look after the interest of the Crown and the interest of the Indian nation as to what was consented and what was committed by the Crown. But I don't see why we have to have our revenue consolidated into the Crown's federal system and the Crown's provincial. When the province administers the resources transferred, those still belong to the Indian nation. Those resources are administered by the provinces, yet the 5% of the mines and minerals have never been transferred. They have never been calculated. The 3% of the taxes collected, the 3% of the lumber industry. Why should we have to block pipelines? As long as the Crown, who is the trustee, and all its subjects, to make sure that Mother Earth continues to replenish herself, so that there is balance and harmony, so that our lives will be sustained, that the crown cannot just come in and her subjects to pollute everything and destroy everything. That wasn't what was consented in the treaty. What was consented by the crown is that they'd assimilate and integrate. And they'd use our constitution and be compliant to the Indian nation's constitution. But however, when the crown promised a lawyer to help do our business under the original spirit and intent, we've never had any lawyer. Although one was committed under ceremony on these lands, our peoples, they don't seem to want one law, one constitution that was given to us by Creator, and the consent given to be the enforceable action regarding our constitutional law and what was consented to. Instead, we argue that somebody's head is above the clouds or way below the clouds or whatever. I'm not arguing. I'm just reminding you that we as a nation also need one constitutional lawyer to remind the crown of her interests when he made a treaty consenting. And what was consented by the Indian nation is the interest of the crown. When a crown lawyer commits and swears an oath to protect the interest of the crown, and the interest of the crown is the Indian nation and all this country within Canada. She might have other interests internationally, but within Canada, the interest of the crown is the one she made treaty with the Indian nation. And she committed by an Indian Act and under a bureaucracy of Indian affairs and all those employees to uphold that honor, that trust, that commitment. I don't mean to offend anybody, but however, the elders, in ceremonies, they are the ones that lead the lodge and how that lodge is to be conducted. There is no voting inside the lodge. Nobody votes inside the lodge. The elders will remind the rest of the people how this lodge is to be conducted. Repetitive, constant, exact. There's no voting against the Creator's law. God gave us those lodges to be conducted the same way as it was the first day as it is today. And the same thing that goes when we have elections, election codes, membership codes. We are doing away with our own constitutional law. We are doing away with the way God gave us a constitution. We had committed. You can't say that the laws don't exist. They still exist. They're still there. The Indians are still there. Everything still exists. It's still the same. It's constant, it's repetitive, and it's exact. When you vote, you are doing away with your constitutional law when you vote. There was no voting before. Our leadership was committed. They're committed by the constitutional law of our nation. When the Wiyashuel, the council, are committed, they are the orderly keepers of the law to make sure that the law continues to be in order. Our constitutional law. And our elders need to remind our, our peoples across this country. We have a constitution and we need to follow it. We can't continue just making up new paths, new roads. You don't need to make new roads when we've already been committed by the consent given by our leaders when the treaty was concluded. Even before the treaty that was the law. That was the way. And that's how God gave us law. And we must continue using our law. How can we defend ourselves as a nation? Saying, for as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows, when we don't even honor our law. But our law is still there, and it needs to be honored, and it needs to be brought back to life, and it needs to be utilized the way it was given. And that's how we have to continue. And the elders are a very backbone of our nation. The very backbone that must remind our people that chiefs and councils do not override the elders. The elders are not an appointed senate. They're not to be appointed by anyone. They've been committed by creation to be among us as a peoples, as elders, to be offered the tobacco if you require the information required. And the truth needs to be spoken when the tobacco is given. You have to speak the truth and you have to tell the truth. There's so many things that I would like to say. But I believe that I hope I hit the major arteries of our constitutional law. That we have to continue to be the nation that was given by creation to be a nation, to be a peoples that share, that care for one another. It's not about anger. The treaty and the consent given was a holistic way of sharing and caring for one another. Not fighting over fish. Not fighting over something we already have an interest with, that where we have to, again, take away the monies of the beneficiary and buy into something that we own already, that we have a share in it. We have an interest. But those shares must come to become visible, and our own treasury, again, must be brought into view. Not the way it's being handled now, this Indian Act that is bogus, that is made up by the federal government. That's not the Indian Act. I'm talking about the original spirit and intent of the Indian Act, where we were given a lawyer to help do our business, a doctor, where the Hudson Bay Company was sued because they sold our lands and our goods. And the Crown has a responsibility. I am telling you that we have to move forward. We don't need to be drafting or anything or great big writing. It's already there. It already exists. We need to remind the Crown when we are ready, when we have prepared and understand who we are, what we are, we must once again remind the Crown what the duties are, what they committed, what the duties of the bureaucracy of Indian Affairs and what the Indian Act is supposed to be like, and what they committed to, and what the Governor General's duties are, and the Lieutenant Governor Generals in all the provinces. The Crown is not divisible. The federal, the provinces, all the subjects of the Crown, they're not divisible. The head of state is the Crown. Here, Trudeau cannot go sit in the International to try and represent Canada. The Governor General, only the Crown, is recognized by the Indian nation, the successors of the Crown. That's what was committed and agreed to and consented by our people, the successors of the Crown. Not a federal government just because they bought over a 1982, whatever they bought over, to come try and take over this country. Their constitution is not enforceable by law. The Indian nation still owns this country, and the Indian nation's constitution is still enforceable. That's what's enforceable here in this country. And that the RCMP, the Red Coat, has the duty to make sure not to try and, not all kinds of protests and whatever, put it back in order the way it was agreed to, the way it was consented to. It was consented to have harmony, to have balance, to share. But however, the sharing of the resources, it doesn't look the way it was promised, the way it was consented to by the Crown. So I remind the elders that you are the backbone of our nation, the Constitution of the Indian nation, and that no chief, no council supersedes the constitutional law of our Father as given by creation, of how we consented to with the Crown, how we were going to live, how we were going to continue in this country to share. So I'll stop at that. I don't want to offend no chiefs, no headmen or whatever. But I'd like to remind you, if you require the knowledge and the wisdom of the elders, and that the elders shall honor that tobacco to be honest and truthful, there cannot be no reconciliation without the truth. And those elders know the truth. They sit with the truth. You cannot be influenced by a foreign government to tell you what is the truth. You know the truth. The elders know the truth. And that needs to be told, the truth, the way we were given as a peoples, the constitutional law given by creation. And that truth needs to be told, and it needs to be followed, so that the nation, again, shall not be interfered with by a foreign policy. The education, they say, is dangerous. But sometimes you don't need to be looking into the federal government's law, the provincial government's law, to argue legally on behalf of the Indian nation. That law there, you cannot argue your law. You cannot argue your constitution, you cannot argue the treaty, you cannot argue the leadership if you are coming from a foreign government's law. If you're trying to If you're trying to argue the federal government's policy and the provincial's policy applies to your nation, it doesn't. You've got to come from within your constitution, within the Indian nation's constitution. You can only come from that perspective to be able to talk about the Indian nation's constitution and what was consented and given consent to the Crown, and what the Crown consented to also. So I'll leave you at that in hopes that we as a people, again, will rise and continue what was given to us. We don't need to look for it. It's already there. But we need to continue. We need to give it. We need to give it an awakening so that we shall proceed. I don't need to develop no new roads. I don't need to develop no new constitution or election laws or citizenship laws. It's all there. It's already been done. It's already been consented. It's already made for us. So therefore, let's move forward. Bye-bye.